Hello and welcome to another political dialogue program. This week we have very important guest Meghan Bodette, director of the Kurdish Peace Institute. We're going to talk about the situation of Kurdish leader Mr. Abdullah Öcalan, as well as the latest developments and about the Kurdish question, also the ongoing campaign which is Freedom for Öcalan and Political Solution for Kurdish question. I would like to welcome first dear Meghan. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on the program.
Thank you, Meghan. First of all, would like to start with the latest development that Kurdish leader Mr. Abdullah Öcalan, after 43 months of incarceration, incommunicado situation, he's been able to see his nephew Ömer Öcalan, and then Mr. Öcalan has a message to the Kurds and Kurdish friends as well. He's saying that he is very well, strong enough to bring the conflict between Kurds and Turks to a much more peaceful process, and the isolation still continues, that he underlines that as well. So first of all, what would you like to say on the isolation of Öcalan, as well as the latest message of Öcalan? How would you evaluate all these very shortly?
Thank you so much. This is a very important topic because that message is important. We know from previous peace processes that the PKK and the wider Kurdish movement and Kurdish society, as well as the Turkish government, have accepted Abdullah Öcalan as an interlocutor, and that it's Öcalan's theories that form the sort of basis for what a political solution to this issue would look like, not only for Kurds in Turkey, but for attempts to resolve the regional Kurdish question as a whole. And so it's extremely important that he be able to participate in such a process in order to facilitate an end to this conflict. Obviously, he's unable to do that if he's barred from communicating with the outside world. On the one side, too, this is a violation, as we know, of Turkish law, European and international law. So the basic precondition for simply following established legal frameworks and procedures would be allowing Öcalan to communicate with his family and his lawyers. And then for peace talks, allowing him to participate, in the way that he has before, and to fully be able to share those frameworks, negotiate on behalf of the Kurdish movement for a political solution. We saw last time that because these negotiations were being conducted while he was in prison, when the Turkish state was unwilling to continue with the negotiations because they no longer served Erdogan's political fortunes, they were able to simply cut off his communication and stop talking to him. So this is why I think the Kurds this time are demanding freedom for Öcalan, so that he will be able to participate in such a process, if there is to be one, without this risk that the Turkish government will simply decide that they don't want to talk to him anymore and cut off communication. So I think his latest message is very important. I think that this violation of Turkish and international law in preventing him to communicate is an impediment to peace. And I think we'd all like to see a political resolution to the Kurdish issue in Turkey, and would want the fulfillment of any practical conditions that make that more likely. So I think that it's really important that we're talking about this issue.
Thank you, Meghan. Secondly, also the peace process and dialogues between Turkey and Kurds is on agenda now of the Turkish right as well. As you followed up the Turkish far right, one of the leaders, Bahçeli, has made statements and talking about bringing Mr. Öcalan to the parliamentary to give a speech, but they asking to the PKK and Kurdish movement to give up the fight, basically. So about these peace negotiations and to stop the war, what else needs to be done by international community, and what should be the Kurdish people's and also the Kurdish movement's position to bring the conflict to the peaceful negotiations table?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that disarmament is typically the final stage of a peace negotiation. It's not the starting stage of negotiations. And so these maximalist demands that the Turkish government is making are likely posturing at this point. Erdogan and Bahçeli are in a position where they know that they cannot defeat the PKK or address the Kurdish issue by military force. They've been trying to do so for the past 10 years. Previous Turkish governments have sought to end this issue by force since the founding of the Turkish Republic, and it simply has not worked. Kurdish people are still demanding the recognition of their identity and the existence of self-governance and civil rights, and the denial of this identity and forcible repression of attempts to seek this identity by political means have only created conflict. They have not made the problem go away. Now, Erdogan knows this, Bahçeli knows this, the Turkish government knows this. That's why even when they make these very maximalist demands that it's impossible that the Kurdish movement would agree to without other steps being taken, the very fact that Bahçeli feels as though he has to say that Abdullah Öcalan should come to parliament means that the Turkish government recognizes that there is not a military solution, and that to come to a political solution, they have to negotiate with the leader of this movement. So I think this is a recognition that their policies of war and conflict and repression have failed. They are still making these very maximalist demands. I think where the role of the international community comes in is, one, reconsidering policies that provide military or legal support for Turkey's ability to wage that war. We see Turkey's defense industry still very reliant on foreign weapons and foreign components for domestically produced weapons. That's not an incentive to sit down and talk. We see the criminalization of Kurdish politics and Kurdish political movements in the international community. That also makes peace more difficult because it makes it virtually impossible for the international community to engage with one party to the conflict. So reconsidering these kinds of steps, and also offering support in mediation, negotiation. Ultimately, this is an internal issue related to Turkey and related to Kurdistan and the Kurdish community. But the international community, given the role in provoking and prolonging this conflict, they should own up to that, and for their own interest in promoting security, stability, and democracy in the region, they should want to help. I think that in order to get to a position where productive negotiations are possible, as I mentioned previously, we would have to see Abdullah Öcalan able to participate freely in such a process in a way that the Turkish state could not simply cut off his communication or refuse to speak to him. We would ideally want to see a ceasefire as well. It's very difficult to talk about peace when you have Turkish air and drone strikes targeting civilian infrastructure in Rojava in northeast Syria, cutting off power and water to millions of people. It's very difficult for negotiations to go on in that context. So a two-sided ceasefire, ideally monitored by some sort of international mediator acceptable to both sides, would be ideal. And then finally, we would need to see an end to political repression. Look, if the government of Turkey wants the Kurdish movement and the Kurdish community to believe that it is possible or desirable to lay down arms, they have to create conditions wherein achieving Kurdish rights and Kurdish self-governments by peaceful means is possible. Now, Kurds have created a model by which they can do that. The pro-Kurdish political movement in their municipalities has really test-driven a lot of the policies that they see as a model for a solution. But what is Erdogan's government doing right now? They are imprisoning and removing from office elected Kurdish mayors. They are taking over these municipalities. They're essentially saying, we don't want you to participate in democratic politics. And so I think that looking at these next steps, we would want to see an end to the international community's policies that prolong this war. We'd want to see international interest in getting to negotiations between Öcalan and the state and to a ceasefire. And we would want to see real political commitments, on behalf of the Turkish government to allowing the political space for this issue to be discussed without violence. I think in conditions where you have Öcalan being unable to communicate, being recognized as the Kurdish side's lead negotiator, if you have conditions where Turkey is bombing Iraq and Syria every day, and you have conditions where the government is cracking down on peaceful democratic Kurdish politics, it's going to be very hard to have peace talks. But fundamentally, as I mentioned before, we've seen that in those conditions, look, that's what's been going on for the past 10 years. That hasn't worked. The military solution has failed. The Turkish government knows that, and it's time to pursue another approach.
Thank you, Meghan. That was a clear to the point analysis. But also you mentioned the Turkey's bombardments as well, and bombing the infrastructures of the people living down there. So this is kind of a war crime as well. But very shortly, very briefly, what is Turkey trying to achieve by bombing Rojava and leaving people without water and electricity there? Also, what I understand from your answer, there is saying that the action speaks louder than words, basically. So the Kurds are waiting for action for a peaceful negotiations, but not the words, only the words, basically. So how would you going to evaluate that just before we come to the Öcalan and his ideas? Very shortly, please.
Of course. So Turkey's aim in targeting critical civilian infrastructure, including energy and water infrastructure across North and East Syria, is to make life unlivable for the 4 to 5 million people who live in that region, particularly Kurds, Christians, Yazidis, other communities that have suffered persecution at the hands of Turkish governments and extremist groups in the past. The goal is the forced demographic change, the ethnic cleansing of those communities in order to both break the social base of the autonomous administration and the Syrian Democratic Forces, and to remove these communities from Turkey's border so that Turkey can resettle, often by force and in violation of international law, Syrians from other parts of Syria in that territory. So this is ethnic cleansing, this is a violation of international law, and this is massively destabilizing because it is those Kurdish, Christian, Arab communities working together who created the autonomous administration and the Syrian Democratic Forces, who defeated ISIS, who worked with the international community to ensure that ISIS could no longer threaten the world from that region. And so these attacks aren't just a massive human rights violation, they threaten to give ISIS a new lease on life, empower all kinds of bad actors in that region, and really create a lot of instability that's bad for Kurdish people, bad for the people of Northeast Syria, bad for the international community, and ultimately not good for Turkey either. So that's what's going on there. And again, I think you put it perfectly well. Actions speak louder than words. I think that it is very important when we see words and statements about negotiations, look, that's an opportunity. You know, we don't want to throw this away. But at the same time, if the Turkish government is going to say that they want to solve this problem, it's important that they be held to that. Right? It's important that we get from a point where they're simply making these statements but taking action that prolongs conflict to a point where their actions are aligned with their statements. And ultimately, you know, and this is something that we're going to get into Öcalan's writings, you know, he talks a lot about in the roadmap, in other writings of his. A political solution to the Kurdish issue isn't something that should be done just as charity for Kurdish people. A Turkey that could resolve this problem would be a stronger, peaceful, more pluralist country, you know, a better place for all citizens of Turkey, Turkish or Kurdish, to live, and a model for what peace and coexistence could look like in the region. So ultimately, this is in their interests too to solve as a country and as a society. And so it's time for the international community, I think, to help them see that, and for, you know, both sides to really start taking steps. I say both sides. I think the Kurdish side has taken all of the steps that they can take, but we would want to see the Turkish government align their actions with their words, and the international community, their allies, to help them do that.
Yeah. In connection with the last question, basically Öcalan and his ideas, how important figure do you think Öcalan, and do you think the key role that he has to bring peace and sustainability to the Middle East is inspirational to the Western powers as well, or is it a threat? So how do you evaluate that? But please, very shortly, because we have a few questions more.
Yeah, you know, I'll never forget visiting Manbij the first time in North and East Syria. It's an Arab majority city. I was there on a research trip in 2021, and we went to the Malajin, which is the women's house. and met with a group of local Arab women who were working in the Women's House to do everything from resolving domestic violence cases to providing literacy courses for women who couldn't go to school. And when I was talking to them about all of their work helping their community recover after ISIS, one woman said to me, completely unprompted, we hadn't been talking about political philosophy at all. She said, I need you to know and I need you to tell people in your country that all of us are here because of Öcalan's ideas. And I think that when we look at what these ideas are, the framework he's proposing for the region, it's based on local democracy, it's based on gender equality, it's based on coexistence and pluralism between all the different ethnic and religious communities that live in the Middle East. And these are ideas that really can address the problems that you have in that region. And not just the problems in that region, because these types of problems, we might see them expressed so intensely in the Middle East because of the history of colonialism and war and fundamentalism and nationalism there. But these problems are global problems. They exist everywhere. And when we look at northeast Syria, a place where these ideas are being put into practice by many people from many different ethnic and religious backgrounds, many different political backgrounds, we see that this locally rooted, democratic, gender equal, ethnic and religious pluralist model has successfully helped this region recover from some of the most horrific persecution and conflict under ISIS, become the most stable part of Syria, and try to build itself back up again in a context where, when you look at the rest of Syria, you look at other war-torn countries, we're not seeing this kind of progress. Now, that's not to say everything's perfect, but they have been able to take these ideas to really resolve some of the most serious problems we see in global politics and conflict, and to build a better future for themselves. So I think that's proof enough that those ideas work, and that they can work in some of the most difficult contexts in the world.
Thank you, Meghan. Also, another important issue is about the latest developments on the Freedom for Öcalan political solution for Kurdish question campaign still continues. It's been 2 years, and lately in Köln there has been a huge demonstration to call peace and freedom for Öcalan. Basically, when you look at from outside, also you visit Kurdistan as well. I would like to ask that one as well, but we have very limited time left. So the campaign, we've seen similar campaigns for Mandela in the history as well. And lately, what was his name? I forget. I always forget his name. The WikiLeaks guy. What was his name?
I don't remember.
Yeah, I don't remember either. Anyway, so many campaigns are still continuing in Belarus as well for the political prisoners. But the Öcalan's situation is totally different than all of these. The total isolation still continues. And with this campaign, basically, Öcalan and his ideas has been represented to the globally, to the grassroots movement. So how important is this campaign, and what else needs to be done to make it bigger and more effective? Please, very shortly, that one.
Yeah, I'll keep it short because we've covered this. At the end of the day, if you want to resolve a conflict, then the leadership of both sides of that conflict have to sit down and talk. So Öcalan needs to be able to participate in those negotiations, and him being free, and in conditions where the Turkish state can't simply just stop talking to him and cut off communication, is essential for that kind of dialogue to work. So I think the campaign is very important in calling attention to that internationally. Personally, I think any step that makes negotiations more possible and a political solution more viable is a positive one. So I do evaluate that positively, and I think it's important to keep explaining why his ideas and his participation matter so much to the resolution of this conflict, and why the resolution of this conflict in and of itself matters to Kurdish people, Turkish people, people in the Middle East, and to the international community as well. So that work should continue to go on.
Thank you, Meghan. That's the last part of the program, and as you know, the 25th of November coming. So the male violence against women is still increasing in the world. So how are the women movements fighting against this on a global scale, first of all, and also how do you evaluate the Kurdish women's struggle? Is it inspirational to the Western women's struggles and the movements as well? Please.
Yeah, I think that I talked about this a little bit when we see what Kurdish women are doing in terms of participating in politics, defending themselves against groups like ISIS, and addressing violence and discrimination in their communities. We aren't only saying that that could be a model for women in other contexts, we already know that it is. Because again, like I mentioned in northeast Syria, we see that women from the Arab community, the Syriac-Assyrian community, the Armenian community, the Yazidi community are working together with Kurdish women to address the challenges that all women face and take on similar struggles in their own communities. We saw that the Kurdish women's movement's philosophy inspired Kurdish women, women from many other different communities in Iran as well, to protest against the Iranian state's misogynistic and discriminatory politics. And in both contexts, we've seen that while it's women leading this work, men have also joined in and will take to the streets together with women to defend equality, because as the Kurdish women's movement believes, it's not just about making women equal to men in a society that's still oppressive, it's about liberating women so that you can liberate everyone, so that all people can live in a more equal and less violent society. We know that the model works. We know that Kurdish women have been able to inspire and share their knowledge with other women, that that's led to very important developments in areas liberated from ISIS, in Iran. And so, you know, it is a model, it is working. And hopefully if we can get to a political resolution of the Kurdish issue, one reason why that's so important is because then these women and their allies will be free to continue to advance and develop their model without having to worry about and suffer from war and conflict.
Thank you, Meghan. Lastly, 27 November is also coming as well. So millions of Kurds are criminalized over the PKK ban, and PKK still calling for a peace. It's been quite a long time that the PKK is one side of the conflict, but the side which calls for the peace, defending the Kurds as well. So how important is to delist the PKK? How effective is going to be delisted PKK from the forbidden organizations list, as well as what is your call to the anniversary of the establishment of the PKK?
Yeah, look, I think I'll repeat what I've said before, is that if you want to resolve a conflict, both sides have to be able to speak to each other, and all other parties interested in seeing a resolution to that conflict have to be able to speak to both sides. Now, what the criminalization of the PKK does is it makes it so that's impossible. We need to end that criminalization to facilitate negotiations and dialogue and make it easier for an agreement to go into place. I've argued this before, and I'll reiterate that again.
Meghan Bodette, Director of Kurdish Peace Institute, thanks for joining us, and thank you for your valuable comments.
Thank you, Aram.
Thank you. Today we came to another end of the political dialogue program, and this week we had Meghan Bodette, the director of the Kurdish Peace Institute, and we already spoke about the situation about Mr. Öcalan, as well as the continuous isolation on him and the latest developments of the peace negotiations. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you on the next political dialogue program.